Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out to the Justice Center tonight. I'm Eric Warren, the Senior Curator of Education for Telfair Museums, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 2019 Jacob and Gwendolyn Lawrence Lecture Series, lecture that we're presenting tonight. This series started shortly after the Justice Center opened up, and it's been the signature program since that time for our Friends of African American Arts member group, which is celebrating its 13th year, and this is the 12th Lawrence lecture that we've now presented in this building. And each year we bring in outstanding scholars, scholars of African American art, scholars of history, and artists, contemporary artists, to speak here at the Justice Center in Savannah. Before we begin, well, I should mention that tonight we have two amazing scholars who are here with us who are going to be the co-editors and directors of a major project, a major publication on the legacy of slavery in Savannah that will also connect to a symposium that will take place in the fall of 2020 and a major contemporary art exhibition that will take place at the same time both here in this building and at the new Cultural Arts Center nearby. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to thank our sponsors. You can see them on screen there. And the lecture is sponsored by the Jacob and Gwendolyn Lawrence Foundation and presented by Telfair Museums Friends of African American Arts with additional investment by the City of Savannah. And also before we begin our discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce two individuals who have made this event possible and many in the past in the Jacob and Gwendolyn Lawrence Lecture Series. Dr. Walter Evans, who is the founder of the Lawrence Lecture, and Mr. Phil Starks, president of Friends of African American Arts. First, I'd like to invite Dr. Evans, who not only has amassed one of the most important collections of African American art and letters in the world, sorry, sandwich there, but he has shared this amazing collection with the public and with scholars to bring about new scholarship and learning both in this community and internationally. So we're very pleased to have him here with us tonight. Please welcome Dr. Walter Evans.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Lawrence Foundation. We were founded in 1999, just before Jacob Lawrence passed. He founded the private foundation, and he personally asked me to be the president, and the president ever since that time. We're Seattle-based. What we do is we support emerging artists, some established artists. We have programs such as this. In fact, we have Lawrence Lectures now in 3 cities and 4 Lawrence Lectures, 2 here in Savannah, here at Telfair, and one at the SCAD Museum. The other cities are in Detroit, where my career was spent, and in Seattle. We also support exhibitions. We've supported major exhibitions at the MoMA in New York, and we have one very exciting exhibition that that is about to open in Salem, Massachusetts, on Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series. It opens, I believe, to the public on January 18th, and it will be, the second venue is the Metropolitan Museum, and it will be going to the Birmingham Museum, including a couple other museums. It's a very, very exciting exhibition. The Struggle series has rarely been shown. I think it's a group of about 30 paintings, and we've located just about all in that series except for 3. We recently found one that was auctioned off recently to a friendly person, and that's going to be in the exhibition. So with that, I won't take up any more of your time. As Harry has said, this is the 12th year. We've had very exciting lecturers, and I think you'll be in for one this evening. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Another amazing night at the Jepson and the Telfair, and I'm glad you decided to come out and share this great event with us. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the board. Calvin, Gwen, Sharon, and Ruth. Would you please stand, please? After the lecture, please join us in the Gathering Community Gallery. This is our third annual Small Works exhibit from some of the artists in the Friends of African American Art. And would you all please stand, artists that are here? Well, thank you very much, and I would like to again welcome Melissa and Talitha. Okay. And thank you all very much, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you.
We're going to turn things over to Shannon Browning-Mullis, Telfair's curator of history and decorative arts, who's going to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our Lawrence lecture. We are so delighted to have Melissa and Talitha join us to talk a bit about their past work, about our current project, and about why both are so important to Savannah today. Dr. Melissa Cooper is a writer, historian, and professor. She's the author of the groundbreaking historical study, Making Gullah, a history of Sapelo Islanders, race, and the American imagination. Making Gullah has captured the attention of general reading audiences, students, and scholars. Cooper's book was reviewed in the New Yorker and was featured in Upscale magazine and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Making Gullah continues to attract popular audiences. Cooper delivered a lecture at the Book Festival in 2017 in Decatur, which is one of the largest independent book festivals in the United States. Dr. Cooper has been featured on several podcasts and radio shows where she's talked about Making Gullah and about American history, a list that includes NPR's Two-Way Street. Interest in Cooper's historical research reaches beyond academic communities in the United States. She's presented her research findings to audiences at international scholars, at conferences in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, Liverpool, Toronto, and Malaga, Spain. Cooper's also the author of Selling Voodoo in Migration Metropolises in Race and Retail, and of Freedom on My Mind, a history of African Americans with documents, an instructor's resource manual. Cooper's authored several blog posts and has written an op-ed for NBC News. Her teaching experience spans more than 2 decades. She's currently an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark, and has been a member of the faculty at the University of South Carolina and Columbia University. Her long teaching career includes teaching diverse populations of learners in New Jersey public high schools. As a result, Dr. Cooper was featured in a Peabody Award-winning documentary, Minding the Gap: Why Good Schools Are Failing Black Students. Dr. Cooper was recently awarded the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship for her current research on ideas about Black suffering in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Welcome, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you.
Dr. Talitha LeFlouria is the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor of African and African American Studies in the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. She's also the founding director of the Public Voices Fellowship sponsored by the Op-Ed Project at UVA. Dr. LeFlouria is a nationally recognized historian and a leading expert on Black women and mass incarceration. She's the author of the multi-award-winning Chained in Silence: Black Women in Convict Labor in the New South, the first history of Black working-class incarcerated women in the post-Civil War period. This book received 6 prizes from the Organization of American Historians, the Association of Black Women Historians, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, the Georgia Historical Society, the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and the Labor and Working Class History Association. She's currently finishing her second single-authored monograph, The Search for Jane Crow: Black Women and Mass Incarceration in America. The Carnegie Corporation supported this project with the prestigious Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. In addition to her scholarly publications, Professor LeFlouria writes for popular media outlets including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Root. Her scholarship has been featured in This Magazine, Huffington Post, The Nation, For Harriet, and Colorblind Magazine. She's appeared on several local and nationally syndicated radio programs and online podcasts. Dr. LeFlouria has also made on-camera appearances on C-SPAN and in several PBS documentaries, including Slavery by Another Name, which was a finalist for the Sundance Film Festival Documentary Award. She will appear in the forthcoming Rust documentary about income inequality in Newark, New Jersey. Welcome, Dr. LeFlouria. So, Melissa, if we could, I'd like to begin by talking about making Gullah. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired that study?
Well, that's actually a long story to give a short answer to, but Making Gullah started originally as a genealogical enterprise. A history teacher teaching in public schools who loved uncovering the past decided to take a deep dive into my family's history. My maternal lineage is from Sapelo Island, and I thought it was really interesting right away that I found these ancestors in 1920s and 30s conceptualized publications. Drums and Shadows, a survival study that was conducted by Savannah unit of the Federal Writers Project, National Geographic magazine, Lydia Parrish's Slave Song collection, and right away questions emerged for me about why during the 1920s and 30s, right, the time when Black people's connection to their African ancestry was the assumed root of their alleged inferiority in the Jim Crow South, why at this moment Black Sapelo Islanders are living under what some might call, the tyranny of very wealthy and affluent whites who took up residence on the island. Why at this moment are there new questions emerging about the value of Black people's African heritage? So I knew that there was a bigger story there, and that story ultimately led me down a lot of different pathways, but certainly sent me to graduate school to try to figure out what was going on in the world of ideas in America at the time that sort of gave rise to what I like to think of as the Gullah explosion of the interwar years.
Well, we are glad you started that genealogical research. Can you talk a little bit about your methodology and your research and what your findings were with your Sapelo Island experience?
So, I specialize in intellectual and cultural history, and tracking down ideas is no easy feat. So, I quickly realized that I needed to expand my area of study to sort of incorporate so much more of America. Quickly, I was like moving away from Sapelo and coastal Georgia, and I found the ideas that I was hoping to make sense about, Gullah, ideas about African survivals, that they took up residence way far outside of the South, So I found myself looking at newspapers and cultural products, films, and fictional works that were popping up in Great Migration popular destinations, New York, Washington, D.C., etc. I found myself looking at the fictional works of Julia Peterkin, and pretty soon, I'm finding that there was an entire debate and discussion that hinged a bit on what was happening with coastal Black folk in the academy between Herskovitz and Fraser and Park, and so the tapestry of ideas gave rise to, the popularity of voodoo tales and a new focus on Black migrants who left the South, and people like the Harlem Renaissance literati championing a search for Black folk culture in certain regions. So the tapestry of ideas and the imagination really started to reveal that the nation was ripe to raise some new questions about Black Southerners and develop a new fascination with the African roots of their culture. So, I did all of the traditional documentary research, but there were other questions that I wanted to answer in the project. And those questions included, what were the legacies of these 1920s and 30s studies? What has Gullah come to mean to people outside of the region? And then I had to take a look at the works of Julie Dash, and I had to think again about how these early studies may have influenced stories that become Mama Day and etc. And then I wanted to also know, I wanted to speak to the tension between the way that Sapelo Islanders and lots of coastal Georgia and South Carolina Blacks understand themselves and their challenges and their struggle and their history, and how outsiders understood them. So one of the methods that I had to adopt in order to get that information was actually conducting oral history interviews, and that proved to be helpful. So I used a lot of different methods to detect something that was really complicated and hard to track down, but ultimately I was satisfied that my questions were largely answered.
So, in thinking about your research, it's really a lot about identity and what are our own identities for ourselves and what are the perceived identities placed on us by others.
Right.
How do you think a better understanding of that through your research can better inform our understanding of American history?
Yeah, what's interesting about what has happened to Sapelo Islanders and other folks who live in communities that have been identified as Gullah is that when people contemplate their historical significance, usually they focus on the idea of African survivals, right? And as Lorenzo Dow Turner proved through his research, there are good reasons why you would look to these communities for African survivals. But there are other forces that also are inextricably linked to their history and experience that aren't usually centered in our celebration and our investigation of Gullah Geechee culture. So I think one of the things that my book does is it creates a sort of space where you have to ask new questions about Low Country Black folks' past. And those questions include, let's look at oppression. Let's look at the historic origins of contemporary problems like the land struggle, right? And if we're going to truly look to the past, let's interrogate the past, all of it, not just the pieces of the past that neatly fit in our nostalgic ideas about, quaint Gullah Geechee folk culture. So, and I think in doing that, the book helps us to really think about the ways, the myriad of ways that we've made race and identity in America. So it's a history that repositions the lens, right? Turning it from the observed and then looking at the observers and thinking about the ways that we've made race and we've made all sorts of meaning around identity.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit with Talitha about your work, and we know that convict leasing has been happening in this country for a very long time, at least since the Civil War, and it was ignored for a long time, but lately there's been really a renaissance of interest in this and a lot of exploration, and I was wondering why you think that is, Talitha, at this moment.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, as we know, mass incarceration is an epidemic in this country. The United States houses 5% of the world's population, but incarcerates 25% of the world's population. So in general, I think that people are interested in making connections between the past and the present to understand this epidemic, which I argue is not a new crisis or a new phenomenon. It's essentially a continuation of, a system that has been with us from the beginning, since the end of the Civil War, since the post-emancipation period. And so today we see it, we see it in its current iteration, which in some ways, it's a war on drugs or a war on poor people, a war on people of color, but in the past it was a war on Black freedom. So my first book, Chained in Silence, tells the stories of the lived and laboring experiences of Black women in post-Civil War Georgia. Just really quickly, my family actually migrated from Georgia during the Second Great Migration. My great-grandparents lived and labored under the fog of Jim Crow. And, much of what I write about in terms of, racial violence, in terms of economic, exclusion and poverty and all of, white supremacy, legacies of, slavery being racism and all of these issues, they were directly impacted by it. So this book, it really just delves into the experiences of women, right, who after the Civil War were also mass incarcerated. There's never been a time in American history when Black women were not disproportionately represented in the criminal and justice system, just as they are today. That's always been the case. And so in the state of Georgia, Black women made up 99% of the prison and jail populations after emancipation. There were close to 3,000 Black women that were sent to chain gangs in the state of Georgia. Black women built railroads, they worked building bridges, they worked as lumberjacks, they worked in mines, they worked on plantations, they worked as cooks, they worked as washerwomen, they worked as the private servants of, prison officials and wardens, and I mean, they did the whole gamut of labor that Black men did after emancipation, but they've never been, they hadn't been recognized until Chained in Silence was published. And there is one scholar I want to shout out. Mary Ellen Curtin was the very first scholar to ever try, to at least address this history. And just a one-chapter analysis, that chapter opened up a whole world of research possibilities for me. So I do want to, give that nod to Mary Ellen. But the whole point is that, I think that people are now interested in convict leasing to make sense of the prison industrial complex that we all are witnessing today, and we're witnessing the effects of that. So as we talk about our Legacy of Slavery project, I just want to say that part of what brings me to this project is the fact that mass incarceration is the legacy of slavery, and it's a lineal descendant.
So can you expand on exactly what you're talking about and talk to us a little bit about how you think we can use an exploration of the past to grapple with current issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you don't know your past, then you really can't move forward, and you really can't improve, we cannot improve our present or even think about, a future that doesn't involve oppression, that doesn't involve, inequality and all of its manifestations, without looking to the past to make sense of where we are. And in order to envision a greater future. So I just think that, history is a vital tool and a resource that we have at our disposal. And I feel like, if you don't know the history, then you really can't move forward. You can't even begin to envision the possibilities of moving forward.
So can you tell us a little bit, your research really focused on individual women in a lot of ways of their experiences. Can you share a couple of those stories with us?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a trigger warning. In my work, I write a lot about violence, and I write a lot about sexual violence. And so as you can imagine, many of these women were sexually abused by prison guards, by men who were called whipping bosses, who were actually hired by the state for the sole purpose of inflicting punishment on people who lived and labored in these prison camps. A lot of times women became pregnant, and some of them died as a result of, childbirth-related illnesses and the like. So I want to share a quick story about a woman named Carrie Massey. I spent about 4 years reconstructing Carrie Massey's story because there were pieces of her all over the country, really. And so Carrie Massey was about 16 years old when she was arrested and accused of killing a shopkeeper. And she claimed that she was allowed to stay overnight, in the shop. And apparently she said that somebody came in, and killed the shopkeeper. I guess she went to see about him, ended up with blood on her dress. They saw the spots of blood on her dress, accused her of, murdering this man, and sentenced her to life. And this was in 1882. So if we flash forward, about a good 10 years, by the time Carrie Massey, before she never reached her 30th birthday, By the time she was 6 years old, she had given birth to 5 babies in the 4 prison camps that she passed through, and she actually died of puerperal sepsis, which was a bacterial infection, after giving birth to her last baby, and the baby died of starvation 2 days later from not being able to get her milk. She had no children, and she was a teenager when she entered the system. Okay, so that is just one of numerous stories that I could tell. And I could also tell the story of Manny Crawford, a woman who was incarcerated for killing her father, who she said repeatedly abused her. And so she killed him, in self-defense. She was given a life sentence, and she actually ended up becoming a blacksmith and was a renowned blacksmith in the city of Milledgeville, where she was incarcerated at the Georgia State Prison Farm, and her story was profiled in the Atlanta Constitution newspaper in 1903 with the heading, "Only Woman Blacksmith in America is a Convict." I actually published the picture in the book. So these are just 2 examples that I can give.
So when we look at stories like this and think about this kind of research, it's often the case that all of these things aren't written down in a transparent way because people don't want to claim these acts. So can you talk a little bit about your research and how you were able to pull together these women's stories?
Yeah, so I don't use like a, traditional research methodology. I use the kitchen sink method. So whatever I find, I use. And I've used records very, creatively. And so, in the 19th century, white journalists were obsessed with documenting Black crime. And so their obsession with Black criminality gave me so much information that I couldn't get, through prison records. So the prison records, they're flat, name, age, crime, county where, the person was arrested, sentence, the end. But if you go to the newspapers, you just type in a name or just type in some racially loaded phrases like "Negress kills," ... And I mean thousands and thousands of, sometimes 10 or 12 newspaper articles about one person, So I found tons of documents that I was able to use to reconstruct the stories and to capitalize off of, these racial, racist dialogues. These racist, newspaper articles. So it was great. And another way that I was able to use the records was to, instead of looking at, whipping reports as instruments of violence, which they are, it documents, how many floggings the person received or what kind of punishments they were given. And these whipping bosses were very creative in the ways that they meted out punishment. But a person has to be punished for something. So looking at why people were punished, fighting back, threatening my life, cursing, running away. So what that showed me is that people resisted and people, clung to their humanity. And so instead of writing a narrative about cruelty, I wanted to also, incorporate some of that, the story of resistance and survival in this hellish situation. So this is part of the way that I was able to use sources.
So who wants to read both these now? All right? I will tell the stories. Well, Telfair Museums is so excited to be embarking on a new project with Dr. Cooper and Dr. LeFlouria called The Legacy of Slavery in Savannah. And before I even talk about it, I do just want to acknowledge that there are people and organizations in this community that have been working on projects around the legacies of slavery for many years, and we're very grateful to them and want to build on that work. But this project is going to be a multi-year initiative that will utilize research, a public symposium, publication, exhibition, community outreach, and oral histories to really delve into what the legacies of slavery are in Savannah in our community. So we have these two lovely ladies who are going to be editing this publication, and we're so excited about it. So can you all tell us a little bit about why you wanted to be a part of this project?
Well, I know for me, after writing and researching, making Gullah, it was really clear to me that Georgia has, coastal Georgia in particular, a very deep history that has not yet been unpacked. I think that there's such an irony, and maybe it's not ironic, but so many people, they flock to the city to experience its charming, historic character. At the same time, there's so little that we actually unpack about that history. And so I, of course, was very excited when we had conversations about the possibility of doing some of that work, disrupting the charm and taking a look at the ways that, oppression, which is a part of the city and the region's past, has left an imprint on the lives of all of the people who live in Savannah and the region. So that is a mission that I'm really happy to be a part of, for sure.
I just had to write down disrupting the charm. I'm going to be using that later. So tell us a little bit about the theoretical framework and your work in selecting the scholars that are going to be a part of the project.
Yeah, so we decided, on a number of different themes that we wanted to address for this project. And those themes include, looking at, for example, the history of racial terror and violence, looking at the history of incarceration, particularly as it pertains to Savannah. I actually spent the last couple of days looking at jail registers, literally from like slavery through post-emancipation, and you couldn't imagine like the racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system today. It's always been that way. Even during the period of slavery, when slavery did the work of containing, and controlling and punishing Black people. So, those are just two examples. We'll also, look at other themes related to the history of segregation, but also civil rights, protests and the freedom struggle. So we're really excited about, delving deeper into the history and, really soliciting your support and input in telling that story, because nobody can tell the story better than the people, who live here and who are a part of that story. So we are really grateful that you welcomed us into your home, and we hope that we can do this project justice.
Thank you. So as you can probably tell by Talitha's comments, Talitha and Melissa have been collecting oral histories in the community, which we're very excited about being able to include. But can you also tell us a few of the scholars who will be contributing?
Oh, of course. Sorry. So Professor Andrew Carl from the University of Virginia, and of course Melissa chime in here at any time.
Andrew is going to be taking on, we're looking for those imprints, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to be taking on the land issue, thinking about environmental justice. I mean, really putting together a lot of different threads that are relevant to coastal Georgia residents, for sure. Mm-hmm. So we've got other people like Mia Bay, who'll be looking at, early segregated transportation fights in Savannah.
We've got Douglas Blackman, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Slavery by Another Name, who will be writing about the history of policing and incarceration in Savannah in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. We've got, who else?
We got so many.
We got so many. So who else should we do? Felicia Jamison?
Yeah, up and coming scholar who will be looking at some eminent domain Black land laws in Liberty County.
Professor Maurice Hobson.
Maurice Hobson, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the very popular book, History of Black Mecca, is going to be looking at the political landscape in Savannah and the rise of Black mayors in the city.
Jelani Favors.
Jelani Favors.
Gotta make it local. So Jelani Favors is doing a piece that looks at student-led protests and civil rights activism, and looking at Savannah State as a case study.
Yeah.
That's all we're going to give you. You have to wait.
There's more.
Those are good ones. I do also want to make a quick mention of the fact that this is one part of this project that will also involve contemporary artists who are working on and creating work today around these issues, and their work will be displayed during this ongoing initiative. But one more question before we open it up to you all, who I'm sure have many questions of your own. We all know this is important, but why is it important now?
Well, so, I think that the 1619 project, one of the things I love about it is that while we're in this moment of commemorating the beginnings of, slavery in North America, or not necessarily commemorating, remembering the beginnings of slavery in North America, we can't forget about slavery's legacies. There's another part of this story. So, I think it's vitally important that we do that. I think I lost my train of thought. Can you remind me of the question? Sorry.
Why now?
Oh, why now? Yeah. So, this is a wonderful moment to begin to think about it. 1619 is a very pivotal year, clearly, in the history of the African American experience. But I think that this conversation is overdue, really. These legacies have been with us, and I think that what we believe that Savannah really is kind of like a case study, or the way that Melissa beautifully put it, a way to detect those legacies, right? So this is like a case study for what's happening all over the nation.
Right. So if we do this right,
this could have national
take
impact
on this project, and our contributors put forth what we know that they hope will be able to put forth. This is sort of a roadmap for how you can detect the legacies of slavery, even outside of this immediate coastal Georgia area.
Well, thank you both, and I would love to welcome questions if we have them. Yes, please.
Hi. I'm currently writing a course studying Native Americans before Georgia. And as part of my research, I've been studying some of the Native American mounds in the Savannah area. I came across a photograph of these mounds being excavated. And I was shocked when I looked at the photograph. It's from the 1930s. First of all, that it was all women. And secondly, they were all African American women. They were not in uniform, but now I'm just curious, could they have been convicts? Do you know if that was part of the labor that convicts did? I just thought it was unusual that it was women doing such tough.
What year? I'm sorry, what time?
In the 1930s.
1930s.
And they were not in prison uniform.
Well, yeah, I mean, by that time, they were, the convict lease system was over, but the chain gang system was still in effect. But there were women who were still doing, hard labor, but they were wearing these sort of like jumpsuits, kind of like the ones that you see pictured in the photograph of my book. So it's not beyond, it's not beyond the bounds of reason to think that they very well may have been doing that labor. I haven't. That's really interesting.
It's the Ivory Mounds excavation, and actually they were WPA employees.
Okay.
And there's wonderful photographs of like the older women with corncob pipes.
Right.
Wow.
It's quite good. It's all part of that same sort of movement, Dr. Cooper, that's going to lead to drums and shadows, and that kind of mystification of African past.
You said Ivory Mounds?
Irene.
Oh, Irene Mounds.
Yeah.
It's where the port is now.
And this is about on the west side.
Okay. That's super.
Well, thank you.
You mentioned about the visual artists. How can the visual artists get involved in this project?
That is a great question. So the physical art will be curated by our contemporary art curator, Rachel Reese, in conjunction with the curator of the Savannah Cultural Arts Center, Lisette Aragante. And would you like people to contact you on this? So actually, if you could go to the Contact Us area of the website, and put in information. The marketing department will forward all those things over.
You talked about your work as a roadmap. Could your work help in Savannah to dismantle white supremacy and white privilege? Would you give us some steps on how we could do that collectively?
No pressure. That's a task. That's an entirely different. Telfair Museums, are you ready to take all that?
So, honestly, that question is exactly what started this project.
Yes.
How can we, as an institution, not lead this effort, but provide a platform and resources for the community to come together to start this work? And one of the most important pieces of this project is that we will be holding town halls around the city, not just in the historic district, to talk with people about what we can do that will be useful, how we can use our resources, what questions they have, what things we're doing that aren't useful or maybe even that are harmful that we don't even realize. In addition to that, we are going to be inviting organizations around the city to be part of this initiative and to hold their own projects and their own events. So I very much hope that this starts out a Telfair Museums project and ends up being a City of Savannah project where our community comes together to make this happen.
Hi, I'm Haley. So first I'd like to say thank you all for including Savannah State in your projects, because a lot of times we get left out of the narrative, you know, just as telling the history of Savannah as well. But I also had a question. So working at the Owens Thomas House, I'm an interpreter. We're starting this new 8th grade project where 8th graders are coming in and they're learning a lot about slavery and things like that. How could we explain the Gullah and this chain gangs and things like that to them in, like, you know, the 8th grade way, so they can understand things like that?
Well, one of the things I'll say after spending a very long time in public school classrooms is I think sometimes we assume that kids can't take information without sort of dressing it down or making it less disturbing, quote unquote. But I think that is a mistake. I think it's important. An important part of doing that dismantling work that you asked about is truth-telling at all levels. I mean, these are realities that students will ultimately come to face, and they'll have to grapple with it. So I think it's important at every level of the educational system that we work hard at finding the language to tell the truth about the past. I think that's really important. So, you know, years ago when I was at the University of South Carolina, my son said, "Oh, come to my class, Gullah lady, why don't you read a story and, you know, talk about sweetgrass baskets or something like that." I told the teacher that you could do that. I told the teacher that. So, you know, of course we read the book and we talked about the beauty and the artistry of the sweetgrass basket. But I also kind of started some conversation about these intellectual and artistic technologies and rice and what that means beyond, right? This was an intellectual, you know, agricultural survival. Africans did not come to North America or anywhere else in the Atlantic world empty-handed. You know, there's a conversation about African survivals, but also I talked to them about the context in which and the forces against which these survivals were able to sort of emerge in the conditions that facilitated their creation. Just a little bit, but it's important to do so. So they're not left with sort of uneven ideas about the past, right? Then it becomes much more jarring when students are sitting in a university classroom encountering a truth after having a whole lifetime of being told simple and sweet stories and quaint meta-narratives that make folks feel good.
Yeah, and I think, like, I agree wholeheartedly with what Melissa said about truth-telling. And I just want to share a really quick funny story, because I actually I got set up so this teacher, I thought I was going to speak to a class of high school students about convict leasing. Well, I show up, and it's a class of third graders. And the teacher was trying to do something very progressive, and I'm like, they're 8 years old. What am I going to do here? And, you know, they're all excited, and I'm like, how in the world am I supposed to talk about this, right? So I'm here, I'm with these kids. I don't have, you know, the background that Melissa does in public education. So I had to wing it. So what I did was, I just started to talk about like the building of the nation. So I knew that the kids kind of knew a little bit about, you know, the Second Industrial Revolution, and they had been learning about how America was built. And so I just started, you know, talking about all the different people who helped build this country. And prisoners helped build this country too, right? And so the railroads and all, I mean, but they were able to, you know, it was digestible. And so I feel like we cannot afford to lie to our children or to not tell them the full truth. It's just how you do it. I mean, you imagine at that age, kids not knowing about slavery. And there are a lot of children who don't. I mean, and I think that the curriculum in and of itself needs to be revised to incorporate the stories of, you know, these very difficult histories. So that's just one quick example of how to get around that.
May I make an announcement, invitation? All Saints Church on Tybee tomorrow night is beginning a year-long program on racial healing. And I honestly want Reverend Jamie Mooring to speak to that. Begins with a dinner at 5:30, little dinner, then the program, then a 15-minute counseling service afterwards. And Reverend Jamie Mooring is kind of in charge of that. He's not actually the priest there, but he is ordained. So would you please, we want you all to come. Racial healing just comes to All Saints Church on Tybee, second Friday of every month. It starts tomorrow night. Jamie?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're using clips from Slavery by Another Name.
Oh, okay.
And The Long Shadow, which looks at slavery through the lens of white privilege, specifically through the Episcopal Church, which is our denomination. Edie is our brilliant, talented organist and choir director. And so we will be using clips and having table discussions, choosing like 10 or 12 minutes, and then 15-minute discussion, and then it'll all end in an hour, because this material, particularly for whites, is just overwhelming for us, because we don't know the history like you do. And when we've heard the stories like Slavery of Another Name, and then reading Lewis Henry Gates's recent documentary that PBS has released, it's horrific for us. And it's and we need to know those stories. But to do it for more than an hour at a time, I thought we would just spread it over 9 months and do it the second Friday of every month.
Okay.
Someone had mentioned the legacy of slavery, and to my mind, I'm thinking that you are referring to the period of what happened after Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, up to the current time. Is there a piece that, I love that term that you have, Dr. Kugler, the American imagination. Is there a piece in, and you got a lot of it, I know, I'm not trying to add to it, but is there a piece on not necessarily media, because media means something to us differently nowadays, but the whole thing of advertising and how materials were put out into the world, either in the newspapers or magazines, that debased and dehumanized the former slaves, so that it made it even more difficult for them, because people got these images, from everything from babies and alligator bait, and right on up to, I'd say, welfare queens that Reagan talked about. All of these different kinds of imagery affected African American people and their progress, because even people who never saw an African American at all ever in their daily life, they got that imagery. How imagery affected all of this as well. I don't know.
So we don't have anyone to my mind who is writing directly on the impact of this imagery and and how it helped influence or shape Black people's experiences, because they're very violent, right? But it doesn't mean that, I think you may have just given us an idea. It doesn't mean that we can't potentially incorporate that, or that somebody may not use that as a research tool, may not utilize those kinds of newspapers to inform their own research about the topic. So,
I do just want to go back really quickly and say I very much commend the church that stood up and what they're doing, and I hope it's a really successful program. I agree that, dwelling on things like this for very long can be really overwhelming, and I understand the design, but I do just want to take a minute to acknowledge that it is a luxury for us to be able, as white people, to limit the amount of time we choose to think about these issues. The fact that not everybody has the luxury of limiting the mental energy they spend on that.
I was reading recently in that, and I'm quoting, the real struggle of the 21st century will be not between civilizations or religions, it will be between violence and nonviolence. And so what I'm wondering is how, when we're always examining the history, African American history as this is the challenge, it's the problem, this is what happened. How do we contextualize that against a violent society, and that all the products that you talked about are a result of that violent society? So how do we use that information to move forward and affect that legacy to move towards nonviolence and all the violent forms that you articulate?
I think I'm going to have to answer that question during the reception, because I really don't have an answer. Let me chew on that and digest it a little bit, if that's okay with you.
That's cool.
If there's something that I learned in writing Making Gullah, I learned about the power of the world of ideas. So every book, right, every production, art piece, etc., that helps to stimulate a whole new imaginary becomes an essential element in shifting discourse, eventually shifting behavior, etc. So I spent time doing this work, and I was a teacher, because I really believe in the power of the world of ideas. So I can't say necessarily with any certainty that the end product of this publication will be X, Y, and Z in terms of the types of maybe measurable outcomes that you might be asking about, but certainly contributing to an entirely a new story about the past of this region to the world of ideas will certainly be helpful, I think.
This is, Savannah's a tapestry of so many things, including our military history. And I was quite amazed a little while back, the City of Savannah archivists do a wonderful job putting up displays, and they had done one for the marking the anniversary of World War I. And as part of the display,
there was a whole section on the contribution of the African American soldier. And we've heard a lot of stories, and I've read a lot of books about World War II and supposedly equal troops going into battle. But I haven't thought about the impact of the World War I soldier that was going thinking that they were fighting for freedom and finding that it did not translate when they got back to this new world. And I was wondering if you were going to have anyone working on your project that would help mark that contribution of African American soldiers to the fights that Savannah certainly was part of because of our military bases.
Well, we actually don't have a contributor writing on that particular topic. But again, I think that, there are so many pearls and great ideas that are coming out of this conversation. So we will most certainly, consider potentially, well, I don't think we'd be able to find anybody to interview. I don't know.
The nature of an archive is they have a lot of documentation.
Yeah, they do.
But there was no there was no interpretation of what that data really meant, and I think that would be very interesting.
I don't want to get away from Georgia's history too much, but I just had a question. I know you mentioned you went to other places outside of America. So one of the places
outside of the South.
Well, United States, sorry.
No, outside of the South.
Yeah, outside of the South.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you said Dominican Republic.
Well, those are places where I talked about my research.
Oh, you talked about your research. Well, how was it received? You talked to them about your research?
Yes.
How was that received there? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, it was interesting. This was a conference where it was the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. Okay. So a lot of your audiences are people who are already very much in line with the idea that, the Dominican Republic is an essential part of the African diaspora. But certainly, that was a big theme at the conference, was even, tensions around identity and the African past relative to, local populations. For sure, the people who came to the talk were already, preached to the choir of sorts, right? These weren't ideas that they weren't ready for or weren't already sort of, associated with.
Hello, everyone. Really enjoyed the presentation. My name is Nkinga Jackson. I'm wearing dual hats today. One is a representative of the Louisville Heritage and Renaissance Center, which is an African American museum in Bullitt County started by African Americans, and we are commemorating the 400-year history of African Americans, and we invite you to commemorate with us. We're doing cemetery tours and many other things. But I'm also a local OBGYN physician and part of the South Atlantic Medical Association, which traces its roots here in the area back to 1892. Is there any talk in this piece about health disparities?
Yeah, we were having so many conversations about how we look for that imprint, remember? And one of the places where we knew the imprint would be probably very detectable would be in health and the outcomes that people experience, around medical care, etc. So I think we really struggled with, what sort of contributor could do the best job in a public-facing project that required them to do the deep dive. There's so much ground to be covered here. I'm not sure that our publication can cover it all. I think that also tells us something about the legacies of slavery, that there's so much ground to cover. So that was something that we were going back and forth about. How do we pick health disparities and income inequality and that. So, we're still in conversation, but certainly we are collecting oral history, so we're very interested in talking to people like yourself who have, a relationship to these industries where we might detect some of these imprints.
And I will say that, you know, the legacies of slavery are not identical in different places. And so Talitha and Melissa have shared with me that as they go through this oral history process, they are finding out, you know, which issues affect Savannah more or less than they anticipated, and that is shaping the topics that are going into the volume.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, Savannah's civil rights movement needs to be on the maps. We were so floored by what we've learned and just how underrepresented it is in the historical literature, that every American doesn't know W.W. Law's name. I mean, 2 minutes into our time in Savannah, we knew who he was. You know, that's so essential. So essential. Because all movements are really local. Legislation happens up here. Bureaucracies do things up here, but it's on the ground that real change happens. So that is certainly one aspect of Savannah's story that we really hope to kind of put on the map.
My name is Teresa Martin, and my husband and I have something in the exhibit, in the art exhibit. But you as a school teacher, I'm having some success. I want to go forward in this endeavor to make our history known to children in a positive way where they can grow. So what I was doing, I've been making historic dolls. So, to explain to you how successful something has been that I've done with dolls, was that I made a Sojourner Truth doll. And she's sitting in her chair. I didn't put it in this exhibit, but I could show you a picture later. But she's sitting in her chair in her iconic position with the table and her scarf and her head wrap. And so I made the doll, and it sat in my house for a long time, and my great-grandchild came along, and he said, Granny, I want to take that doll to school and do a report, because this is African American Black History Weekend. I want to talk about Sojourner Truth. And he took that doll to school with him, and he gave the most sophisticated report. He was just about 8 years old, right? About 7 or 8. And he gave an extremely, and I had my camera and I was looking at him, and he, children were asked a couple of questions, and the children had never heard of Sojourner Truth, but he was telling them in such a profound way about her, and he had it out there, and it was just one way of giving them positive imaging in a difficult time, and I thought that was very important. And I was able to interject the difficulty of her life, but at the same time, the strength of her life, because it was done in a way on his level where he could understand, and it was very successful. So I'll be doing these history dolls, and so they've been very successful in teaching children. And one time I had a couple other experiences that the children actually took a modern day doll to talk to a doll in history.
Thank you for sharing.
I just wanted to tell you that going forward with teaching children, there are ways to get this message to them without feeling dejected or put them on or
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Melissa and Talitha for being here with us tonight.
Don't move this yet. I want to get a picture.
I also want to thank all of you for embarking on this journey with us, and I hope you will continue over the next year or two to be part of this project. And I just want to remind you that there is a reception sponsored by the Friends of African American Art in the community gallery.